by appearance. I'm Gregory Wang. I'm going to help to moderate this panel. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yes, Joerg. I'm artist, critic, publisher, and directing the Center of Photography in Geneva, and I will gonna talk about a show we made in 2010 that had quite a lot of success that I called The Revenge of the Photographic Archive, that gave the title to our talk this morning.
I'm Charles Merewether. I'm a curator, sometimes, freelance, and I'm a writer permanently. I'm sometimes a university professor. And I live in the country of Georgia, village.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Emerson Wang. I'm based in Taipei. And 2013, I moved back to Taipei. And afterward, I was the director of Art Taipei. And I was also the fellow curator of National Museum for Contemporary Art in South Korea. And so now I'm a curator and art critic.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna try to frame this topic, that is the revenge of archival photography. We'll start by a presentation of Joerg, and we'll start to go from different figures, from adject to different events. You will see different the way different artists consider archive in their own practice, and we will after have a presentation by Charles, and we'll open the end with different practice of artists, including archive in their work, knowing this notion of archive could be taught through different aspects, because most of you here also are interested in new media, and we know that it's a real topic today, how to deal with all this data, but how artists work with what they call living archives too. So we will try to go through all this subject together, but I propose we start with your presentation.
Thank you, Gregory. Yes, so the idea of the revenge of the photographic archive came because I'm running an institution that I inherited from photographers. They founded it in '84 in Geneva, and in the world of photography, more or less, this fight for getting accepted as a fine art was, in my eyes, a wrong battle, because photographers in general, they try to do art, they do fine art. So they think that it's an aesthetic question. And this is a bit a long thing, because the 20th century already started with other questions than aesthetics. We can say from the Demoiselle d'Avignon on, and especially Dada, aesthetic is not anymore the main concern for modern and contemporary art. But in the world of photography, and even till today, I would say, it's a kind of phantom. And I try to develop an idea that it maybe came from another side, the exception of photography as an art. And I took it in the way as it entered in the museum, and we can be, I think, all okay on that it was Eugene Adger who was the first photographer who got accepted in the museums. Now, we have a whole bunch of photographers through the 20th century like Aceh, who have been thinking their work first as an archive. We have, of course, Aceh. We have also, sorry, I'm going the wrong sense. Now it's working. We have also Baroness Abbott, who brought Aceh to New York. We have, of course, also Volker Evans. He is the main figure in this questioning. And when we think about the archive that he built up in the 30s, he was in charge of the government of Roosevelt, more precisely by the FSA, by the Farm Security Administration, to build up a huge archive of the south of the states concerning the enormous poverty in the field of land workers or little farmers, and he was reflecting of how to build this archive that is until today it's available for everybody. It's the biggest, until today, the biggest photo archive in the world, a public photo archive in the world. And he was referring to the New York Public Library. In the New York Public Library, a woman collected something in a short time, something like 1 million of photos. We have to know that in the beginning, and especially in the States, the first photo archive had been constructed in libraries, in public libraries. Even the first photo department in a museum came out of the library. It's the case of the MoMA. MoMA was the first museum integrating photography in their program, and they made it only, I think, 2 or 3 years after the opening of the MoMA, because before it was also in the library. So this is one observation. So we know that Evans took the Public Library of New York as an example of building the huge archive that we have in Washington, yeah?
I think it's very important to understand where this model exactly come from in the next development talk.
And so I was reading in this very interesting collection of essays of Douglas Crimp that another lady, also at the Public Library, but 40 years later, in the 70s, was founding the Department of Fine Art in the collection of photo of the Public New York Library. And she was doing that by destroying books, by destroying portfolios, because she went, for example, in the department of, let's say, Egyptology. And in Egyptology, they have very precious photos, for example, of Maxime Ducamp, of the pyramids, or of Firth. And in the 70s, there was the first time that people get really aware about photography. Douglas Crimp even says that photography may be invented in 1839, but discovered in the 70s. It means that photography became a discursive object only in the 70s, and this has to do first, I think, with the fact that the famous essay of Walter Benjamin had a reception very late. It starts in the 60s and 60s. And then you have in the 70s the first important reflections. Thanks to you, I integrate also, of course, Victor Bergin, but it was also John Berger, or it was Susan Sontag, and you have just in 1980 the famous essay of Barth. So this means that you have in the intellectual world thinking of photography at the same time when you have the post-avant-garde, land art, body art, who is reusing photography, because photography was banned by American modernism. Do you remember all? Greenberg could do nothing with it, and Greenberg and his bunch reinstored a kind of academy ranking as we had it before the historical avant-gardes, because the historical avant-gardes, the artists like Moholy-Nagy, like Rodchenko, Verena Stepanova, etc., they used photography because they all wished to transform society, to build a new man, and so they worked with the mediums of their time, and it was just the rising up of mass medias like printed photography or cinema. But this get forgotten, and after the war with American modernism, we had again an old hierarchy. So the 70s was very important for that. And in this way, I would say that photography came in the museum through the artists of the historical avant-garde on one side, and on the other side, it came in the museum when photography discovered itself as a force, as an archive concept. It's inherent to photography to build an archive. And so, and this is why the title, the Revenge of the Photographic Archive, because a long time photography was in the cellar of the museum as slave of art history, as reproducing painting and sculpture. And from the moment on when photography get aware of its amazing power or archive power, into the museum. It was Ajay and then Volker Evans and all the others we know. So this is a bit the topic, but we don't have a lot of time. So,
but it's very interesting to understand also this moment where when photograph was mainly considered as document and not like exactly as artworks. And maybe you can tell a little bit more when you think about the practice of other artists, including this archive in the process. We're talking about Victor Bergin. Could you give like other example of artists?
If you want to think about artists using photography in post-war, you have it on different levels, of course. You have, for example, this very important moment when Robert Rauschenberg made his first silk screens of photography on canvas that Warhol just shortly afterwards practiced. Or, for example, you have a kind of continuity from Dadaism. You have a lot of Dadaist artists who have their own archives. They had archives because they're doing collage. So, for example, Rodchenko has his own archive, and Hannah Höch made books with a lot of collected photos from printed medias. And later, when they use it as a document, especially land artists, because they had their work so far away from the museum, or body artists who need a trace because the work was during only 1 minute, 1 hour, but it was so much limited in time that they needed a trace. So you have different ways of working with it. You have artists who used it just as a documentation, but you have also other artists who made with the photo documentation new works, like Michael Heiser. When you invite Michael Heiser in a show about land art, if you don't give him a wall less than 50 meters, he is not interested, because he is reconstructing on 50 meters a kind of feeling of space by reproducing his own works that are very far away. So this is a bit
with Robert Smithson and different artists who also, some artists play with that. At some point they were using documents and they finally decided to print.
But for example, Smithson more used it as a document than as a work. You quoted yesterday Mata Clark. Mata Clark made works with his photo documentation that he built up with cut-up. No, it's a collage technique that Mata Clark used, and then of course it becomes a work again.
Okay. Maybe Charles, you want to jump maybe in your presentation and after we make maybe a discussion altogether? Yes, no? Oh, of course you can write.
But I mean, if you can name one artist or a moment when, I mean, you mentioned very people like Mata Clark, when their documentation becomes an artwork, when you know, the shift. I mean, sure, Mata Clark and other artists that you mentioned are documenting their practice, or land art is a good example. But it's at a certain moment there must have been a shift, or an artist who shifts their work, their documentation work, to being an artwork in itself. You understand?
Yes, but it's a case for many artists, performing artists, was it?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, for example, I know very well Anna Mendieta's work, and I know that at a certain moment in 1975, she had been documenting her earth practice, where she buried herself in the ground, and she was documenting it, and she put the photo on the wall as a document. And she'd taken a photograph of herself against a tree, it's called Tree of Life or something, and she looked at it, and it was a Green Street gallery, and there's a moment when, and it's in her diaries, you can see it, or in her letters, she realized that it had its own life. It wasn't just a document.
Yeah, but sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, compared, for example, to other artists from the pioneering performance, for example, Valley Export or others, Anna Mendieta made their performance never for a public. I mean, she made it only for cameras. There was nobody never assisting to that. So it can be only a work. This is a different situation. I spoke about these performers who made for a public in a given space at a given time a performance, and then document their works. But I mean, we have also the other situation that documenting the world, like Volker Evans. This kind of work became art because it was thought as an archive. This is on what I would like to insist. And I mean, in the field of contemporary art, we have the position. We could draw a line from Atget to over Volker Evans and August Sander and Karl Blossfeld and and come in a patch and come to Bechers. This is this kind of photography or photographic work that a long time didn't had was not really categorized as art, no?
Okay, and from the better, I think maybe it's interesting you start here the presentation.
No, you can't hold it, Stuart. So this is quite a formal presentation, forgive me. I'm not capable of eloquently, informally giving the presentation. It's a presentation which is based on a larger essay, and I transformed it into a presentation today. I just want to thank the organizer, Cecilia in particular, and her staff very much for the invitation to come all this way from Georgia. And I wasn't sure whether it was such a long flight, I wasn't quite sure whether I would come. But with Cecilia's coaxing and the opportunity to be here back in Hong Kong, Macau, Hong Kong, I took the opportunity. So thank you, Celia, and thank you everyone for coming. So I've called my presentation Archival Malpractice and Counter Strategies. The dialectical image is one that appears in a flash. It is thus in the image that flashes up in the now of recognizability, that the has been grasped. It's a quote from Walter Benjamin. Between 1975 and 1979, some 7,000 photographs were taken of Cambodians who died at the hands of the Khmer Rouge at the Tolong Sleng camp in Phnom Penh. These photographs represent less than half of the 14,000 plus prisoners who were detained and killed in the camp. How can we view these photographs that now form an archive of genocide? What to do when we cursorily see such photographs on a bookstore stand or in a museum or on a museum wall, as I initially did? One of many photographs sharing a space according to the commonality of their medium or the genre of portraiture. What is the basis on which one can compare what disappears from sight in the equivalence brought to bear by this apparently simple act of classification and building a collection or curating an exhibition? Is there not something profoundly disruptive to this photographic act? Realizing that these portraits of Cambodians were imposed upon a subject who already knew that the taking of their photographs was a sign of their fate. Is it not disturbing to recognize that the photography has been harnessed as an instrument of fear, and that these archives were originally constructed as evidence of the exercise of power on the part of a genocidal state apparatus? What claims can be made for these photographs, and by them? The philosopher Levinas wrote of how art freezes time, that it is about the meanwhile, a duration or an interval in which being is able to traverse, but its shadow immobilized. Art, he wrote, offers consolation because it is an interval in the movement of time and death. However, it is precisely within the space of the interval or duration in which the body is frozen in time, transformed into an object that then enables the appropriation and confirms the primacy of the viewing subject, ourselves. Levinas goes on to propose the resemblance is not as a result of the comparison between an image and the original, but it's the very movement that engenders the image. Reality would not only be what it is, what it's disclosed to be in truth, but also its double, its shadow, its image. As such, Levinas hence has grave doubts that representation can do any more than mitigate against this recognition. I quote, "On the depth of the concreteness of the time, that is a responsibility for the other, there is a diachrony of a past that cannot be gathered into representation." We may also say, viewing these images, that it reveals a fracture that has enabled the constitution of the present. It belongs to the future anterior, that which will have been. This anterior future that is neither past nor present. It punctures time. The issue of time is what haunts the image, and in turn the archive. Invisible, belonging to a different order of legibility, disrupting the mnemonic order. Walter Benjamin associated the issue of time with mechanical reproduction and the shock or the trauma of modernity. Through the modernity of mechanical reproduction, that is, through the repetition of these images, this interval of time exposes belatedness and will attain a meaning as an index of a traumatic event. Photography then is both inside the structure of the event, that is, it exists by virtue of being within a temporal moment of a subject, and excessive insofar as that lasts and is therefore outside the temporal space of the event itself. It becomes a remainer. The act of archival preservation exposes us to a violent division, the traumatic experience of the event having embedded itself in the act of representation. It occurs without knowledge. In this sense, it is carried forward as an unclaimed experience, suffering a perpetual belatedness. Lost through time, these images have no destiny until acknowledged and reclaimed. We become the belated witness to something that has been repressed, unrecognized, unassimilated. It's the very exteriority of the gaze that we can no longer control, that it disturbs the present, forcing us to question not the order of representation so much as the recognition of something else. Such a perspective offers a way of thinking about the claims or demand these photographs make on us. These images of the prisoners of Tulong Slang prison show the remaining imprint of the subject who have been killed and those of the perpetrator. The photographer who is present but not imaged, and ourselves, the viewer, always arriving too late, but bracketed with the frame of the photographer, and therefore we as the spectator are destined to repeat the original scene of violence. We are placed before the subject and in place of the photographer, whose act presages the death of the subject. We become the camera eye and the accomplice in the death of the subject. Archives made for the future, as if we are forced to inherit this act of violence, to live with the victory of the persecutors. The Khmer Rouge left behind records, logbooks, photographs, confessions, and written autobiographies, and a daily execution log that lists the name, age, occupation, and the village of origin of each of the enemy executed. We learn that the prisoners were blindfolded, interrogated, tortured, and forced to write these autobiographies, detailing their work and their family background. This autobiography was then cross-checked with other records and used against the prisoners when the regime so desired. These autobiographies, as with the confessions, were then also used against the authors by pointing to discrepancies between one memory and another. And therefore, if there was a discrepancy, as there always was, it was evidence of a guilt. On completion, the blindfold was removed from the prisoners and the prisoners were photographed. These are the photographs that you see now. Together as an archive, these photographs provide a detailed documentation and account of not only his prisoners, but also the killing of hundreds of thousands of Cambodian civilians. Each week the prison authorities would send their evidence to Pol Pot, keeping him informed as to how well they were doing their job. Van Nuff, one of the 7 prisoners who survived, recalls, handcuffed and blindfolded, they led us to a room on the ground floor and had us sit on the floor. I heard the clock and realized it was 3 in the morning. Every prisoner was interrogated again about his past, and then it was my turn. Afterwards they untied my blindfold. In front of me was a chair with a camera set on it. "Go sit on the chair," the guard said. The others handcuffed me, and I was photographed. The guard took a picture in front of my face and then the back of my head. Another guard measured my head, and then they made an ID card. They photographed the other people attached to me and put their blindfolds back on. The photographic method deployed by the Khmer Rouge produced a blank fear when suddenly exposed to the unerring gaze of the camera. It's as if being blindfolded enclosed them in a darkness that is associated to the moment of death. The camera functions to unburden the gaze of the body, from the body, to differentiate from what it sees. No one sees anything. Everything becomes dissociated. The blindfold separates the persecuted from the persecutor. The body confesses under interrogation. There's nothing pristine about these photographs. No care given, as if who and what they represent belongs to a country's heritage and therefore remembered. And yet, the images carry too the signs of their temporal passage, the mark of wear and tear that embody the violent conditions of their production. They've been abandoned, disused remnants. With time, the image has been corroded, becoming increasingly illegible. This condition is a mark of history and its destitution. And yet, like noise, these scratches persist as marks of time, acting as interference. This condition rehearses the fate of the subject. The French theoretician Christian Metz defined photographs in general as an arrested image, as if to say the camera takes captive of its subject. He writes of the cut inside the reference that intervenes in the real, to derealize or make unreal the photograph. The image, he says, while appearing to preserve its subject by removing it from the real, in fact seals its fate. Metz writes, photography cuts off a piece of the reference, a fragment, a part object, for a long, immobile journey of no return. The deployment of photography was critical in the establishment of a database, as I mentioned, and an archive, because it could provide a record of those arrested and proof of those who admitted their guilt. It was evidence that confirmed Pol Pot's fear of a threatening groundswell of treason and deceit. The destruction of the overwhelming number of individuals under the Khmer Rouge was justified as necessary to purify a country and a nation of alien elements. The construction of the archive symbolizes the law and power to dictate the terms created in the delirium of the persecutors. This infernal archival machine that systematically creates documents not in order to remember, but to produce evidence that its very mode of construction confirms their act of violence and the legitimacy of the archive. In 1979, the Vietnamese installed government transformed the Long prison into a museum of genocide. Arguably, it was established to create a distance from the Khmer Rouge, especially from Kun-Seng and Heng Sam-min, who were former officers and leaders of the Cambodian government. Open to the public, the museum displayed the torture instruments, the documents relating to the forced confessions, the personal possessions of the prisoners, and on its walls these photographs. Along with other information, the visitors of the museum wrote the names of people they recognized on the photographs when they visited the museum. The process of classification of which these photographs have been a part were re-signified. They were given back a name. The systematic record of the Khmer Rouge had become the basis for renaming, of giving back their identities to these faces, of reclaiming lost lives. How to deal with the legacy that the archive presents to us, and what kind of legacy exactly? To what extent do the methods used to record history and the means of organization inform the way in which history may be viewed and the kind of truth it holds, especially an archive produced by perpetrators? What use can be made of such archives in the aftermath of such a violent regime or of civil conflict? Do they provide a means of answering the untold histories that have been forgotten, banished, or repressed? To what extent can archives help people to overcome actual experiences that have been passed into history? And is there some obligation to the past, a responsibility towards the dead, to keep whatever records that there are of their lives and symbolically stand for the unspeakable that troubles those who wish to forget and want to live without history? While to preserve the archive is to acknowledge the right of memory, we may equally ask, what kind of memory and against whose memory? Van Nath, one of the survivors, as I mentioned, remarked in an interview, if I were to meet Pol Pot or Leng Sari today, I wouldn't have anything to say to them. In fact, I did meet a former guard sometime around 1981 when I was working at the museum as a guide. He was in a crowd of people outside the gate of the prison, of the Genocide Museum, as it is now. I recognized him immediately. When he saw me, he tried to cover his face with a scarf, but I grabbed him by the hand and I pulled him into the cell block. And I said, if you were me and you caught me like this, maybe you would kill me. I told him, but I want to show you that not all people are evil like you. If you don't want to believe me, I'll take you out right now and tell all the people outside you that you are a guard and you'll be killed immediately. The guard had a blank look on his face, the look of an illiterate, unthinking man. He put his palms in his hands and kneeled on the floor in front of me, begging me for his life. I looked at him for a long minute and then I let him go. It's the consequence of the events that matters, not the cause nor the agents. What counts for Van Nath is a form of revenge that is to do with recognition. The long minute of recollection, as he says. It's the politicization of memory. That long minute is not about Van Nath remembering one of the perpetrators, but it's about making the perpetrator recognize the immemorial past. I recall once again Levinas, who speaks of the exposure to the other in the face-to-face encounter with another human being.
that both threatens and commands me. I quote, "The face signifies the fact of summoning me, in all its nudity of its institution, in everything that is precarious in question, in all the hazards of mortality, the unresolved alternative between being and nothingness, a questioning which summons me." Such archives created by repressive regimes or those that document genocide or acts of great violence pose different kinds of risks and questions. When faced with the evidence, with these photographs and documents, former leaders of the Khmer Rouge offered their own way of dealing with the past. The former Prime Minister Kun-Seng and one of the leaders remarked, "If a wound does not hurt me, you should not poke it with a stick and make it bleed." Another says, and he was involved also, he was asked whether the Khmer Rouge were responsible for the massive number of deaths, and he said, "Please leave this to history. This is an old story. Please leave it to the past." The very idea of a clean slate is precisely what the Khmer Rouge wanted to achieve through genocide, to be rid of those who do not belong. Enforcing cultural amnesia follows as the necessary stage for rewriting the past. We may ask, is collective amnesia by way of amnesty the only path to recover in places where there have been repressive regimes? As Van Nath said, "I have tried to forget, but it's useless. As long as I live, it seems I will never be able to forget even a small part of it. That memory is involuntary, persistent, against his will. Nothing will erase it because it has been as much tied to the future as to the past." To conclude, whose memory does the museum represent? And when we see such photographs in a museum, those of the 7 survivors or the family members of those killed? And what kind of memory does it provide us? What is the place of memory in the archive or the museum? Can the existence of such archival museum console those who suffered? To those Cambodians, the museum is not a place to mourn their dead. Memory and mourning is for this culture a sacred private act, not shared by anyone, especially not in the public.
Thank you, Charles. After this powerful presentation, I would like maybe to ask Joerg to react. What if you think it's this kind of photography could be it could be like also a revenge of archival photography. What is your thought about that?
I don't know if we could quickly go back. I speak to the people of the technique, to the file I gave you, because I could respond with images to this very impressive statement you made. Let's see.
So statement that.
Great. Okay, so I try to go forward. It's quite. Yeah. I don't know. It's a bit time. I'm sorry. Because this is a bit what I spoke about. And so in the show.
Just so Christian Botanski images on the way.
Well, we had several. So it's a way to respond. It's a Brazilian photographer. She's really kind of an old lady of the Brazilian photography. I just have a hole in my memory.
So if you
okay, anyway. She is very well known for her photographic work. She started very experimentally. And then in the 70s, Claudia Andusha. Claudia Andusha is born in Hungary and from a Swiss mother and a Hungarian father. And she had to flee with her mother to Switzerland, and then the mother went to New York, and then she went to Brazil, and her mother joined her in Brazil. So she started her whole life in Brazil, became a famous photographer, and especially well known for her work about the Yanomami Indians in the Amazon. And she was an important figure in the show, also because what I like often is to integrate political activists, because of course activists work with photography, or people who become, through their photographic practice, activists. And this is what happened to her. She became so close to these Yanomamis, and I think it's the most touching photographs you can see of these Indians of the Amazon, with so much empathy. And she became so close to them that, for example, she went to Geneva to defend the rights of the Yanomami. And during the dictatorship in Brazil, they had been very badly treated. And so she started to try to find medical help for them. And for this medical help, comment on dit quand on te fait des piqûres, les vaccins. Vaccin? How you say vaccin? Vaccination, thank you. So for the vaccination, as these people have no name, they call them only by family affiliation. So they have no name, and for the people who brought this medical help, they had to identify them because they need a second and a third vaccination. So they put them numbers. And maybe this was the key work of the show, but I didn't know that. It was already once she came to Switzerland and explained to me what is with this archive. Because these photos she made only to recognize the people for a second or third vaccination. And years after, she went through her archive and she saw these photos with these people of these numbers. And as the whole part of the family of father's side was executed in Auschwitz, all of a sudden it came up and thinking, what the hell do I have done to these people? I'd treated them like in other execution situations, just what you showed, you know. And then she decided that these photos belong also to the artistic body of her work. So it's a way to answer. Sorry. This was in the mid-80s.
This makes me think also of maybe you know this Christian Patterson. He published this amazing book that was awarded in Arles, Rencontre d'Arles 2012, called The Reheaded Pickerwood. It's about how artists also start to use all this archive and create a narration. It's about a very violent, start to create a narration and create their own work using archive. It's one step I would like to bring to jump in Emerson's presentation. And it's good you talk about this artist, and at this moment, at some point, now we see more and more artists because of this importance of narration in contemporary art, who are using different kind of archivings and it will be a way maybe to present your topic.
Thank you. So first of all, respond to the title is very interesting and also very provoking. Some people ask me why you use revenge to talk about photographic archive. So when I think about this topic, I would like to also show some artist practice works for the example. Okay, and this is like just talk about this. First of all, actually, all those archives are put in the library that no one discovered. So it's like a historical information and never displayed or never showed to somebody. But afterward, that maybe some curators or artists, they start to find out those more interesting information. So they start to think about how to reproduce or recreate as artwork. So like Hall Forster, he said, using those historical information, afterward the artist elaborate with like to form it as an installation to recreate as an artistic form. And like Michel Foucault, he said that it is the general system of the formation, transformation of statements to use this archive. So like I take some example like Gerhardt. We know he's a very famous painter, but he also used photography to as his part of his works, especially this series called Atlas. This Atlas actually you use it since the 1960s, I think. And from the beginning also, he only collect everything from his daily life. He didn't really on purpose to think about those information he will use as artwork. But afterward, he think about maybe he to recollect or to create to put all together. Maybe it's like his daily life, and through those artworks that people can see what kind of the artist's daily life it was in the past. So he used it to recreate as his work. This is so afterward he showed in the museum, in the galleries, and people start to read, like reading books, reading diaries, and through those photographic archives to see it. And so it was from 1960, ongoing. This is the ongoing project. And then the other one is Bernhard Hiller Becker. This is what we know. But of course, in the beginning, that people doesn't think this is such kind of photography, especially. We think about photographers, they always related to journalists because they have to record such moment, what happened. It's like the past or something that's really happening in the past. So we make it as an archive to see the historical moment. But after they put that like tour, they start to travel around everywhere and to find out the similar buildings to make it all together. So like photography system to make it as like artistic works to use it. So this is the other way to think about photography. This is what I think. So afterward, actually, because it also one question is that always people think is photography also artwork, especially after what I was the director of one art fair, and art fairs also go into the art market, and is photography can be collective. This is always the question. So we have to think about it, and also to think about that when artists do start to make photography, it can be also artistic work. And then I also take some example using the archive for photography. And first one is a Taiwanese artist called Hou Suzhi, and that's one project called Out of Place. So this is one trilogy of Kaohsiung military dependence village, and this village afterwards defenses. And this show was shown last year in Kaohsiung Fine Arts Museum called Out of Place, and she started to work as to interview with the local people, and those people actually were from 1949. They were from KMT government and military moved to Taiwan. So every time they think about is that one day they will go back to China. They never think about that Taiwan is their hometown. They always want to go back to China. So in Taiwan, they always make one village and think about this is like a small China. We live together. We have our own life. We have our own language. We eat everything just like in China. But after 50 years, after 6 years, they still stay in Taiwan. So they have to think, where is their hometown? And so this is like, so Hou Suzhi, she took the old pictures, and then afterwards she also interviewed those people nowadays, and they compare with the old pictures and new pictures all together and make it as an installation, and also rebuild their village in the museum. This one, so this is actually compare with two, the old one and new one all together. And this one is Zhang Qianqi. Zhang Qianqi, the artist, I think he will show in Total Museum in Seoul. And this is his new work called The World That Never Was. He also interviewed his mother, asked his mother, does she know about the Cold War? And also he uses a lot of different material from video art, from TV, and also from newspaper archives, photographic archives, to talking about those Cold War era, those pictures. And so this is a video art, and then also this is shown in the Cube space in Taipei. But the most famous one, the series is those called the Chen people. I think you know it was shown in Sao Paulo Biennale. It's also, he took those pictures, those people actually, they are abnormal people, and they all put together in one like hospital, but they are isolated from the outside the social life. So, but he recorded and reproduced it as archive. But actually it was not archive, but actually he reproduced as archive. And talking about like historical story. And the third one, this another example is that called Zhou Qinghui. Zhou Qinghui actually he used it. He started to read a lot of old documents, and then he reproduced the photography as archive. But those photography are new ones, and he set up the scene all in the zoo. He talked about the zoo, and he wanted to make a new project. He asked to set up the like stage and ask the people to ask the actors, actresses, and stay on the stage, and then they took the photo and talking about the old time lifestyle. So he started to question what is archive, what is photography archive. So my summarize is using poetic expression to intervenes in reality with multi-narratives formed to doubt and resist power structures in capital flows, population, migration, religious and national powers. This is nowadays most of people they use in photography to reflect we so-called what is artistic photography, or just take it as archive. This is what I think. So maybe this is my short presentation, and also we can discuss about this, how we talk about to use old archives to form it as photography, or now we use a new photography to reproduce as archive. Thank you.